"Pretend you love me for 10 minutes," said the governor's wife. And what the mountain man did shocked her, and the whole town. The dust of the streets still hung heavy when she grabbed his hand, desperate to escape a mob's fury. A rugged stranger stepped forward, pulling her close, silencing the crowd with nothing but his scarred stare. But what began as a 10-minute pretense soon turned into a battle for justice. Behind the governor's grand doors lay a dying secret, one that could strip native families of their land and destroy every promise ever made. Now, whispers of scandal spread faster than wildfire. The governor's wife accused of betraying her vows. The mountain man thrown in irons. The railroad men tightening their grip. Lanterns flicker. Jail keys rattle. Hymns rise against the night, because mercy itself is on trial. Can't one woman's courage and one man's strength overcome lies that threaten to tear a whole town apart? Before we begin, send a quick wave in the comments. Tell me your city, your country, your vibe. It's amazing how stories like this echo across the world. The autumn wind whistled through Alamosa's dusty streets, carrying the sharp scent of wood smoke and approaching winter. Ava Winslow sat straight-backed in her carriage, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap as angry voices grew louder outside. Through the window, she watched the gathering crowd with mounting concern. Ranchers in weathered dusters, shopkeepers, still wearing their work aprons, and miners with coal-smudged faces pressed closer, their expressions dark with discontent. "Where's the governor?" someone shouted. "To find a face, honest folk. These new tax'll break us." Another voice rose above the din. "And his lady rides around town like nothing's wrong." Ava's heart hammered against her ribs as the crowd surrounded her carriage. The driver, young Tommy Wells, gripped the reins harder but seemed unsure whether to press forward or retreat. The horses stamped nervously, picking up on the tension in the air dot through the sea of angry faces. Ava's gaze found an island of stillness. A tall man stood apart from the crowd, his broad shoulders draped in a buckskin coat worn smooth by weather and wear. A loaded mule stood beside him, strings of prime furs hanging from its pack saddle. But it was his face that caught her attention, weathered and scarred, with eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. The crowd pressed closer, making the carriage rock slightly. In that moment of fear, Ava made a decision born of desperation. She caught the mountain man's eye and leaned toward the window. "Please," she whispered, just loud enough to carry to him. "Pretend you love me for 10 minutes. The man's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He studied her for a long moment that felt like forever. Then, with the fluid grace of a mountain lion, he handed his mule's lead rope to a nearby boy and stepped forward. The crowd parted instinctively before him. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who knew his own strength and rarely needed to prove it. Reaching the carriage, he removed his worn leather glove and extended his hand to Ava. She placed her trembling fingers in his calloused palm. With grave courtesy, he bent and pressed his lips to her knuckles. The gesture was both gallant and possessive, a clear message to the watching crowd. A murmur rippled through the gathered townspeople. Ava heard the shift in their tone, from anger to uncertainty. No one seemed eager to challenge a man who moved like he did, who carried himself with such quiet authority. "Everything all right here, ma'am?" His voice was low and rough, like stone, rolling down a mountainside. "Yes, thank you," Ava managed, though her voice wasn't quite steady. "I'm much obliged for your attention." The man, she didn't even know his name yet, turned to face the crowd. His stance was relaxed, but his eyes swept the gathering with predatory focus. One by one, people began to step back, finding urgent business elsewhere. The clatter of hooves announced Sheriff Turner's belated arrival. He took in the scene with a practiced eye, the dispersing crowd. The mountain man standing guard by Ava's carriage, the fresh scratches in the carriage's polish, where someone had struck it. Mrs. Winslow, The sheriff touched his hat. Ezra McGraw. Didn't expect to see you down from the high country so soon. Sheriff. The mountain man Ezra nodded briefly. Perhaps Mr. McGraw would be kind enough to escort you home, ma'am. Sheriff. Turner suggested, though his eyes held a shadow of worry. Seems the town's a mite unsettled today. I would be grateful, Ava said softly, meeting Ezra's gaze. Something unspoken passed between them, her relief, his quiet understanding, and beneath it all, a current of connection neither had expected. Ezra retrieved his mule, then swung up onto the bench beside Tommy. The young driver looked both awed and slightly terrified to share the seat with such a companion. As the carriage wheels began to turn toward the governor's mansion, Ava leaned slightly out the window. Thank you, she said, her voice carrying a weight of meaning beyond simple gratitude. The secret burden in her eyes spoke of troubles deeper than one afternoon's unrest. Ezra touched his hat brim in acknowledgement, his scarred face unreadable. But his eyes stayed alert, scanning the street as they rolled past the scatter of townspeople who still lingered to watch them pass. The autumn wind gusted again, sending yellow leaves skittering across their path like nature's own warning of changes yet to come. The carriage wheels clattered over Alamos's rutted streets, the sound echoing off weathered storefronts. Ezra McGraw rode alongside on his mule, one hand resting casually on his saddle horn, while his eyes constantly scanned the shadows between buildings. Behind the carriage's curtained windows, Ava sat ramrod straight, all too aware of the townspeople's whispers following in their wake. Did you see that mountain man with the governor's wife? Never thought I'd see the likes of him up at the mansion. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as they approached the wrought iron gates of the governor's mansion. White-painted columns rose above carefully tended flower beds, a stark contrast to the rugged frontier town below. As Tommy drew the carriage to a halt, Ava leaned out the window. Mr. McGraw, you must come inside for supper, she said, her voice carrying just loud enough for the curious onlookers lingering nearby. After your gallant assistance today, I insist. Ezra's scarred face revealed nothing, but his eyes met hers, with sharp understanding. Much obliged, Mom. The household servants gathered at the front door, their expressions a mixture of confusion and curiosity as Ezra ducked his tall frame through the entrance. Martha, the cook, wrung her hands in her apron but bobbed a quick curtsy when Ava gave quiet instructions about setting an extra place for supper. In the formal dining room, lamplight gleamed off heavy silver and white linens. Ezra looked out. Of place among the fine furnishings, his buckskin coat and trail-worn boots, a stark contrast to the polished surroundings. But he handled his silverware with surprising grace as Martha served up bowls of venison stew. The governor isn't joining us? Ezra asked quietly, noting the empty chair at the head of the table. Ava's spoon paused halfway to her lips. My husband is indisposed. Upstairs. She set the spoon down carefully. He's been bedridden these past 3 months. The doctors aren't hopeful. Understanding flickered in Ezra's eyes. That explains the unrest in town. No one's seen him. I've been managing affairs as best I can, Ava admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But my position grows more precarious by the day. The railroadmen press for decisions. The ranchers demand answers, and she trailed off, straightening her shoulders. Well, you saw today how some feel about a woman acting in her husband's stead. Reckon I did. Ezra pushed his empty bowl aside. I'll take my leave after supper, ma'am. You've been generous enough. Before Ava could respond, boots sounded on the front porch. Martha hurried in, wringing her hands again. Sheriff Turner's here, ma'am. Says he's checking on your safety after the trouble in town. Ava's eyes flew to Ezra's face. He gave her a slight nod, understanding the necessity without words. When the sheriff was shown in, his sharp gaze took in the intimate dinner setting with obvious surprise. Sheriff Turner, Ava rose smoothly. "How kind of you to call. You know Mr. McGraw?" "Of course. He's a close family protector." The words came out with practiced ease, though her fingers twisted in her skirts beneath the table. Ezra's jaw tightened, but he played along, rising to shake the sheriff's hand. His presence seemed to fill the room, lending weight to Ava's words. "That so?" Turner's eyes narrowed slightly. "Well, good to know you're not alone up here, Mrs. Winslow. Town's unsettled lately. Might be wise to have someone watching out for you." After the sheriff took his leave, Ava turned to Ezra with pleading eyes. "You must stay at least tonight. Rumors are already spreading through town. If you leave now, it'll confirm I'm more than a stranger," Ezra finished grimly. He ran a hand through his graying hair. "One night, in the guest house." Relief softened Ava's features. "Thank you. I know this is far more than the 10 minutes I asked for in town." Later, as evening settled over the mansion grounds, Ezra stood on the guest house porch. Above, a lamp still burned in an upstairs window. He watched Ava's silhouette pause at her husband's door, her shoulders bowing slightly as if under an invisible weight. The burden of her secret duties, her precarious position, seemed to press down on her even here in the privacy of her own home. The autumn wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of approaching winter. Ezra's hand unconsciously touched the old scar on his face as he considered how a desperate 10-minute charade had somehow turned into something far more complicated. In the darkness, a coyote called from the distant hills, its lonely cry echoing. The unspoken questions hanging in the night air. Dawn painted the Colorado sky in streaks of amber and rose. Roosters crowed in distant farmyards, their calls echoing through Alamos's quiet streets. Ezra McGraw stepped out of the governor's guest house, his boots crunching on frost-covered grass. The morning air bit sharp and clean, carrying winter's first whispers. In the small stable beside the guest house, his mule nickered a greeting. Ezra checked her hooves and brushed her coat, the familiar routine settling his thoughts. The animal's warm breath clouded in the cold air as he worked. "Mr. McGraw?" Ava's voice carried softly across the yard. He turned to find her standing at the kitchen door, a coffee pot and 2 tin cups in her hands. Her blue dress was wrinkled, dark circles shadowing her eyes. She'd clearly been up all night. "Come in from the cold," she said. "Please." The kitchen was warm, filled with the rich scent of coffee and baking bread. Ava's hands trembled slightly as she poured, splashing a few drops on the weathered table. "You've been tending him?" Ezra asked quietly. Ava nodded, sinking into a chair. "The fever rose again last night." She wrapped her fingers around her cup, seeking its warmth. "Mr. McGraw, there's something I must tell you. Something that weighs heavy on my conscience." Ezra waited, watching steam rise from his coffee. 2 weeks ago, Henry the governor approved a railroad treaty. Her voice dropped lower. "It gives Silas Pritchard's company rights to grazing lands. Land that belongs to native families." She looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I stood by and watched him sign it. "I'm as guilty as he is. Politics ain't my concern, ma'am." Ezra's voice was gruff. "Never have been. But surely you understand what this means?" Ava leaned forward. "Those families will lose their livelihood. Their children will go hungry." She paused, then added softly, "Your Apache in-law is among them." Ezra's scarred face tightened. Memories of his late wife, Morning Star, flooded back, her gentle hands weaving blankets, her quiet strength as she taught him her people's ways. The thought of her family struggling while railroad men grew fat twisted something deep in his chest. "What do you expect me to do about it?" he asked, but his tone had lost its edge. "Help me make it right." Ava's fingers clutched her cup. "Reverend Parker in town. He has influence with the people. If we could convince him to speak out." Ezra studied her face. seeing not the governor's wife, but a woman haunted by injustice. After a long moment, he nodded once. "I'll ride with you to town." An hour later, they walked Alamos's main street, Ava's gloved hand resting on Ezra's arm. Townsfolk stopped to stare. Whispers followed them like shadows. "Ain't natural, her parading around with that mountain man. Should be home nursing her husband, not gadding about." Ava's spine stiffened, but she kept her chin high, her grip on Ezra's arm never wavering. He felt her trembling slightly, but admired how she faced their judgment without flinching. The church parlor was dim and musty, sunlight filtering through dusty windows. Reverend Parker gathered a small crowd, shopkeepers, ranchers, a few women from his congregation. They sat in straight-back chairs, faces uncertain. Ava stood before them, her voice hesitant at first, but growing stronger. "We speak often of Christian charity, of mercy toward our neighbors." Her hands clasped tightly before her. "Yet we watch in silence as families who have lived here for generations lose their grazing rights. Is this justice?" Ezra stood silent beside her, his presence like a shield. He watched the crowd shift uncomfortably, saw doubt and prejudice war with conscience on their faces. "The railroad brings progress," someone muttered. "Can't stop that. Progress built on broken promises isn't progress at all," Ava countered. But uncertainty crept into her voice. One by one, the townspeople filed out, nodding politely but uncommitted. When the last one left, Ava's shoulders slumped. She sank onto a wooden bench, the weight of failure evident in every line of her body. Ezra stepped closer, laying one weathered hand on her shoulder. He said nothing, but his touch carried strength, a silent promise that she didn't stand alone. Through the church windows, afternoon light spilled across the wooden floor, dust motes dancing in its golden beams. Morning dew sparkled on the mansion's garden. Paths as Ava and Ezra walked between rows of late-blooming asters. The autumn air carried a bite, and Ava pulled her shawl closer around her shoulders. "The old church on Pine Street," she said, gesturing east. "It's been empty since Reverend Parker's congregation built their new one. We could reopen it, make it a gathering place." Ezra's boots crunched on the gravel path. "Folks might not take kindly to mixing there. Then we give them reason to." Ava stopped beside a weathered stone bench. Food, warmth, shelter from the cold. Basic Christian charity that none can rightfully refuse. "The mansion storehouse is well stocked," she continued. "I could spare supplies, beans, flour, blankets for those in need." Ezra studied her face, noting the determination in her eyes. "I know some widows living out past town. Good women, fallen on hard times. I could bring word. Would you?" Ava's face brightened. "And perhaps your Apache friends?" He nodded slowly. "I'll ride out today." By mid-morning, Ezra had loaded his mule with sacks from the mansion storehouse. He spent hours riding the outskirts of Alamosa, stopping at rough-built shacks and lonely homesteads. At each stop, he delivered supplies and a quiet invitation dot as dusk approached. Lantern light began glowing from the old church windows. Ava stood in the doorway, greeting each arrival personally. Widow O'Leary came first, leading 3 other women from the shanties beyond town. Then a group of orphans, shepherded by a gray-haired schoolteacher. Finally, several Apache families arrived, moving with quiet dignity despite their worn clothing. "Welcome," Ava said warmly, touching hands with each person. "Please, come in where it's warm." In the churchyard, Ezra had built a fire under a large iron kettle. The smell of beef stew and cornbread filled the air. Children gathered close, drawn by the warmth and the promise of a full meal inside. Ava distributed blankets and basic supplies. The church's wooden pews had been pushed back, creating an open space where people could sit together. Lanterns cast a gentle glow over the gathering. A young Apache woman began humming softly, an old hymn learned at the mission school. Others joined in, voices blending in English and Apache. The music seemed to ease the tension, drawing the groups closer together. Ezra moved among them, ladling stew into tin cups and crude bowls. He paused beside Ava, who watched a white widow sharing her cornbread with an Apache child. "Look," she whispered. "They're breaking bread together. It's a start." But not everyone approved. Through the open church door, they could see townsfolk passing by, faces dark with judgment. Whispers carried on the evening air. "Ain't proper, the governor's wife consorting with such folk. That mountain man's got too free a hand at the mansion. What would the governor say if he weren't sick? A bed?" Ava's cheeks flushed, but she held her head high, continuing to serve and comfort those who had come seeking help. As the evening drew to a close, families began drifting away into the darkness. Ava and Ezra extinguished the lanterns and banked the fire. The night air had grown cold, their breath visible in the moonlight as they walked back toward the mansion. "Thank you," Ava said softly. "I couldn't have done this alone." Ezra glanced down at her. "You're taking a mighty risk going against town opinion like this." "I know." She wrapped her shawl tighter. "But tonight, for the first time since Henry fell ill, I felt truly strong. Like I was doing something that mattered." She paused, then added quietly, "Even if there's danger ahead." They walked on in silence, their footsteps echoing on the empty street. Behind them, the dark church stood as a symbol of what they'd begun, a fragile bridge between two worlds, built of simple mercy and shared bread. The moon cast their shadows long across the mansion's front path. Ezra waited until Ava was safely inside before turning toward the guest house, his thoughts troubled by the growing whispers in town. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for tonight, they had kindled a small light in the darkness. The autumn wind cut sharp across the plains as Ezra guided his mule between the scattered widow cabins. His axe rang against seasoned pine logs, splitting them into manageable pieces for the women's small stoves. At each stop, he stacked the wood neatly by their doors, remembering Ava's gentle insistence that no one should face winter without warmth. Widow O'Leary came out to thank him at her cabin, her worn shawl pulled tight. "The governor's wife, she's got a good heart," she said, studying him with knowing eyes. "Don't let folks' mean talk stop what you're doing." Ezra just nodded, uncomfortable with the hint of something deeper in her words. He'd nearly finished his rounds when he heard hoofbeats approaching fast along the dusty road. A rider appeared, his saddlebags bulging with papers. As the man passed, sheets scattered in his wake, dancing on the wind like fallen leaves. Dismounting, Ezra snatched one from a clump of sage. His jaw tightened as he read the bold print. Notice to VSAT by order of the Territorial Railroad Commission, all persons occupying lands designated for railway expansion must remove themselves and property. Within 30 days, trespassers will be subject to arrest. He gathered more of the handbills, his scarred hands crushing them as he thought of the widows, the native families, all who scratched out life on these disputed acres. The sun was setting when he rode through the mansion gates, the crumpled notices heavy in his coat pocket. Ava met him in the kitchen, her face falling as he spread the wrinkled papers across the wooden table. "No," she whispered, fingers tracing the harsh words. "They cannot do this. These families have nowhere else to go." She moved quickly, pulling out writing paper and pen. "We must call a council meeting. There are still good people in town who'll stand against this." Her writing was swift but precise as she composed letters to merchants, ranchers, and church elders. She trusted. The kitchen grew dim as evening deepened. Ezra lit the oil lamp while Ava worked, her earlier confidence giving way to tremors in her hands. The pen scratched unevenly now, ink blotting where her fingers shook. "What if no one comes?" she asked softly, not looking up. What if they're all too afraid of the railroad men? Ezra set a bowl of simple bean soup beside her half-finished. "Letters. Eat something," he said gruffly. Then, more gently, "You ain't standing alone anymore." She glanced up, surprise and something warmer flickering in her eyes. "No," she agreed quietly. "I suppose I'm not." After supper, Ava climbed the mansion's creaking stairs to check on her husband. The governor's room was thick with shadow and fever heat. He stirred as she approached, his face gaunt in the low lamplight. "The treaty," he mumbled, tossing against the pillows. "Should never have signed. Let them pressure me." "She," Ava soothed, taking his hot hand between her cool ones. "Rest easy, Henry. I promise I'll make it right." His fingers clutched weakly at hers, always stronger than I deserved. She sat with him until his breathing steadied into sleep, then made her way back downstairs. In the kitchen, Ezra had cleared the supper dishes. He sat in the lamp's golden circle, methodically drawing a whetstone along his knife blade. The steady scraping paused as Ava entered. She noticed how his eyes seemed focused on something distant, something painted in the lamplight's flicker. Her words about making things right had stirred old wounds. She realized memories of his Apache wife, perhaps, and promises he couldn't keep. "The letters are ready," she said softly, gathering them into a neat stack. "We'll send them out first thing tomorrow." Ezra nodded, resuming his rhythmic sharpening. The lamp flame danced across the blade's gleaming edge, casting strange shadows on the kitchen walls. Neither spoke of the risks ahead, but both felt the weight of what they'd begun, a stand against powers that could crush them both. Outside, the wind moaned around the mansion's eaves, carrying winter's warning. But in the lamp-lit kitchen, resolve hardened like steel beneath the whetstone's steady stroke. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Morning sunlight streamed through the church's newly cleaned windows, casting long shadows across worn wooden pews. The building filled slowly as townsfolk filed in, their boots scraping against the floorboards. Some sat straight-backed and attentive, while others lounged with arms crossed, skepticism plain on their faces. Ava stood at the front, her cream-colored dress stark against the dark wood of the pulpit. Her fingers trembled slightly as she smoothed the papers before her, but her voice rang clear when she spoke. 2 years ago, my husband made sacred promises to this territory. She lifted a document bearing the governor's seal. He pledged that every family, whether rancher or herder, would have fair claim to grazing lands, that no one would go hungry, while others prospered. Whispers rustled through the crowd like wind through prairie grass. Ezra leaned against the back wall, his weathered face unreadable as he watched Ava continue. "Now the railroad men bring notices of eviction." She held up one of the crumpled handbills. They would drive widows from their homes, force native families from their traditional grounds. "Is this the justice we stand for?" "Ain't our problem," someone called from the back. Governor signed the new tree fair and square. "Under pressure and fever-sick," Ava countered, her chin lifting. "But we can still choose differently." Ezra pushed away from the wall, his spurs ringing as he stepped forward. "Reckon I've buried enough folk out here," he said, his low voice carrying through the sudden quiet. "Seen what happens when winter catches families with no shelter, no grazing for their stock." He looked around the room, meeting eyes that quickly glanced away. "Some of you shared coffee with my Apache wife when others wouldn't. Some of you helped dig graves for each other's kin. That land out there holds both our victories and our sorrows." Murmurs rose again, but different now. Widow Leary stood up from her pew, her gray hair escaping its bun. "Last winter, when my Johnny took sick, Mrs. Winslow brought soup and blankets herself, sat up with him 3 nights running." Her voice quavered but held firm. "While some of you fine folk worried about being seen with a poor widow, more voices joined in, sharing stories of quiet kindness. but others shifted uncomfortably, exchanging knowing looks at how Ezra stood near Ava, how her eyes sought his when her courage wavered. "It ain't proper," a merchant's wife stage whispered. "They're spending so much time with that rough mountain man, her husband barely cold in his bed." "The governor still lives," Ava said sharply, color rising in her pale cheeks. "And I stand here with his authority, asking you to remember your better natures. Will you let the railroad men divide us? Or will you stand together, as neighbors should?" The church grew quiet save for the creak of wooden benches and the distant call of meadowlarks. Then old Reverend Mills rose slowly to his feet. "The good book says we're to care for widows and strangers," he said, nodding toward Ava. "Seems to me that's exactly what Mrs. Winslow's been doing. Maybe we ought to follow her example." One by one, people began to nod. A rancher promised to help challenge the eviction notices. A shopkeeper offered to share his storehouse if winter proved harsh. The tide of opinion shifted like prairie grass in the wind, bending toward compassion. As afternoon light faded to evening, the last townspeople trickled out. Ava sank into a front pew, her strength finally failing. The weight of the day pressed down on her shoulders, making her seem smaller in the vast empty church. Ezra appeared beside her, offering his arm. "Best get some air," he said quietly. She let him help her up, leaning briefly against his strength as they made their way outside. The prairie wind swept around them, cool and clean, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Ava closed her eyes, drawing in a deep breath. "I have never felt so tired," she whispered, "or so certain. It's as though God's own strength is lifting me up, even when I think I cannot take another step." Ezra said nothing, but his eyes rested on her face with careful consideration. Something like respect flickered in their depths as he watched her gather herself, straightening despite her exhaustion. They walked back to the mansion beneath the first evening stars, their steps falling naturally in rhythm. Neither spoke of how their shared purpose had forged something deeper than mere alliance. But with each step through the gathering dusk, the invisible bonds between them drew a little tighter, a little stronger. The stars emerged one by one above them, bright and steady as truth, while behind them the old church stood as witness to promises made and courage found. Dawn painted the eastern sky in bands of rose and gold as Ava stepped out onto the mansion's front porch. The morning air held autumn's crisp bite, and dew sparkled on the grass like scattered diamonds. Ezra waited by a sturdy wagon, checking the harness on 2 bay horses. He'd traded his usual mule for proper transportation, knowing the importance of making a dignified appearance. Ava descended the steps, her traveling dress practical but neat, her hair tucked sensibly beneath a modest bonnet. "I hope we're not too late setting out," she said, accepting Ezra's hand as he helped her onto the wagon seat. "Sun's barely up," he replied, settling beside her. "Reckon we'll make good time if the weather holds." The wagon wheels creaked as they rolled out of town, past curious eyes peering through shop windows. The rutted road soon gave way to open country, their path winding through stands of yellow cottonwoods and across stretches of sage-dotted prairie. Every bump and jolt reminded Ava how far removed this was from her former life in the East. The wagon bounced over rocks and dipped through dry creek beds, making conversation difficult. Still, the silence between her and Ezra felt companionable rather than strained. By midday, they approached the reservation agency's boundaries. Smoke from cooking fires rose in thin columns against the blue sky. Children playing near the road stopped to stare as the wagon passed, then ran ahead shouting news of visitors. They made camp near a grove of pinyon pines, where several Apache elders had agreed to meet them. Ezra helped Ava down from the wagon, then busied himself setting up a proper camp while they waited. Elder Nanton arrived first, his silver hair catching the sunlight as he approached on horseback. Other elders followed, their faces weathered and dignified. They settled in a loose circle, accepting the coffee Ezra offered with grave courtesy. Ava's hands trembled slightly as she faced him, but her voice remained steady. "I come before you to acknowledge a great wrong," she began. "My husband signed a treaty that betrayed your trust and threatens your grazing lands. I cannot undo his signature, but I seek to make it right." She watched their expressions carefully as she outlined her plans for resistance and restitution. Some faces remained impassive, while others showed clear skepticism. "White promises are like morning mist," one elder said. "They vanish when the sun grows hot." "I know you have no reason to trust my words," Ava admitted. "But I ask you to judge me by my actions, not by those who broke faith before." Elder Nanton studied her thoughtfully, then looked to Ezra. "You stand with this woman?" Ezra nodded slowly. "I do. She feeds widows and orphans without asking their blood, speaks truth when lies would be easier." He touched the turquoise pendant at his throat, a gift from his late wife. "My woman would have respected her courage." A murmur went through the gathered elders. They knew Ezra's story, how he had honored his Apache wife in life and death, how he had learned their ways and kept their customs. His word carried weight. After long discussion in their own tongue, Elder Nanton spoke. "We will send 2 men to your town meetings. They will watch and listen. If your actions match your words, perhaps more will follow." The journey home seemed shorter, though the sun was already sliding toward the horizon. Ava sat straighter despite her weariness, energized by the day's progress. "I've never felt so alive," she confessed suddenly. Terrified, if word of today reaches certain ears in Denver, the scandal could destroy everything. And yet, she gestured at the sweeping landscape around them. "This feels more real than all my years of proper teas and social calls." Ezra clicked to the horses before answering. "Truth stands taller than lies," he said finally. "Folks can whisper all they want, but helping people survive winter speaks louder than gossip." Darkness was falling as they rolled up to the mansion. Ava's muscles ached from the long ride. Dust coated her clothes, and her hair had come loose from its pins. Yet she felt oddly reluctant to end the day. She paused on the mansion steps, looking back at Ezra as he gathered the reins to lead the wagon to the stable. Words of gratitude rose to her lips, but they seemed inadequate for all he had helped her accomplish. Their eyes met in the gathering dusk, and she saw her own emotions mirrored there. Hope, determination, and something deeper neither dared to name. With a small nod, she turned and went inside, leaving unspoken things hanging. In the twilight air between them, frost glittered on fallen leaves as Ezra hauled wooden crates of apples into the church basement. The October air carried wood smoke from chimneys and the sweet tang of late harvest. Inside, Ava sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by worn hymnals. Her fingers worked quickly, mending loose pages with needle and thread. "That's the last of the preserves from the mansion cellar," she said, not looking up from her stitching. "Should feed quite a crowd." Ezra set down the crates. Widow O'Leary's bringing 3 pies. Apache women promised dried berries and cornbread. He paused, watching Ava's nimble hands repair another torn binding. "You sure about mixing everyone together like this?" "The Lord's table welcomes all," she replied firmly. "Besides, winter's coming. Breaking bread together might help folks see past their differences before the hard months." They worked steadily through the week. Ezra fixed loose floorboards and wobbly pews while Ava organized the harvest offerings. Together, they rode out to distant homesteads and native camps, extending invitations. Some doors closed in their faces, but others opened cautiously. The evening of the service arrived clear and cool. Lantern light spilled from church windows onto the gathering dusk. Ezra stood at the door, nodding greeting to arrivals. His heart clenched when he saw a familiar Apache. Gestures among the crowd. Memories of his wife's people, her gentle ways. Inside, the plain wooden walls glowed golden. Ava had arranged autumn leaves and wheat sheaves along the windowsills. The air filled with whispered greetings, rustling skirts, and the creak of well-worn boots thawed at first. People clustered in separate groups, ranchers' wives near the front, native families by the door, widows along the sides. But as the piano struck up familiar hymns, voices began to blend. The old tunes needed no translation. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. Ezra watched from the back as Ava moved among the people, touching shoulders, smiling welcome. She had pinned her hair up simply, worn a modest brown dress, but something in her face shone brighter than any. Silk or jewels. When she knelt to offer bread to a shy Apache child, the lamplight caught her profile. His chest tightened at her grace thought the singing swelled, lifting to the rafters. I once was lost, but now I'm found. After the service came the feast, spread on trestle tables in the yard. Lanterns swayed from tree branches, casting warm circles of light. The autumn night stayed mild, stars pricking through purple twilight. People mingled as they filled plates, ranch hands passing cornbread to native elders, widows sharing pie with weather-worn trappers. Ezra found himself drawn into conversation with Elder Nanton about winter grazing routes. The old man's eyes crinkled as he watched children playing tag between the adults. Good medicine, Nanton said softly in Apache, when the circle is whole. Across the yard, Ava ladled soup into tin cups, her laugh carrying on the evening air. She had loosened up as the night went on, relief and joy making her movements more free. Every time Ezra glanced her way, warmth bloomed in his chest, a feeling he thought had died years ago with Sarah. The moon rose full and golden over the church steeple as families began heading home. Ava stood in the doorway, bidding each person goodbye with a touch or word. Ezra helped gather empty plates, stealing glances at her silhouette against the lamplight. Finally, only they remained. Ava lingered by the door, one hand resting on the rough wood frame. Her face held a quiet radiance as she looked out at the moonlit yard where, moments before, ancient barriers had briefly dissolved. For once, the world seemed whole, she whispered. Ezra moved to stand beside her, close enough to catch the faint lavender scent of her soap. He nodded, though unease flickered at the edges of his contentment. Such perfect moments rarely lasted in his experience. The wider world had ways of shattering peace, but for now, in this space between twilight and night, he let himself share her quiet joy. They stood together in companionable silence, watching moonlight silver the empty churchyard where, for one golden evening, hope had seemed possible. Dawn painted the kitchen windows with pale autumn light. Ava hummed softly as she kneaded bread dough, taking comfort in the familiar rhythm. The harvest service's warmth still lingered in her memory, though 2 days had passed. She paused at a commotion outside. Running feet, raised voices. Sarah, the kitchen maid, burst through the door. Her face was ashen. "Ma'am, you need to see this." She thrust a crumpled handbill into Ava's flour-dusted hands. Ava's heart stopped as she read the words. Accusations of adultery blazed from the page in stark black ink. Her name, Ezra's name. Lies about secret meetings, inappropriate behavior. The railroad company's seal marked the bottom corner. Her legs weakened. She gripped the edge of the wooden table, leaving white fingerprints in the flour. Through the window, she saw people gathering on the street, passing more handbills, heads bent together in gossip. "Find Mr. McGraw," she told Sarah. "Quick as you can." The girl fled. Ava sank into a kitchen chair, her hands trembling. The bread dough sat forgotten, slowly deflating in its bowl. Ezra arrived within the hour, his face dark with anger. Seen them all over town, he sighed, tossing another handbill onto the table. Railroad men handing them out like candy. What do we do? Ava whispered. Everything we built, the trust, the peace, it's crumbling already. She gestured helplessly at the window. Outside, former friends hurried past without glancing at the mansion. A woman pulled her child to the opposite side of the street. We wait, Ezra said firmly. Truth stands taller than lies, remember? Give folks time to... The kitchen door crashed open. Sheriff Turner stood framed in the doorway, 2 deputies behind him. His face was grim beneath his hat brim. Ezra McGraw, he announced, unrolling a paper. You're under arrest for trespassing on railroad property and inciting unrest among the local populations. What? Ava surged to her feet. That's absurd. He's done nothing wrong. The sheriff wouldn't meet her eyes. Got sworn statements here from railroad officials. Says he's been stirring up trouble, threatening workers. Lies! Ava moved to stand between Ezra and the lawman. Sheriff Turner, you know these charges are false. The railroad is trying to silence us. Step aside, ma'am, Turner said quietly. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Ava. Ezra's. Voice was low. Let them do their job. She whirled to face him. You can't just surrender to their schemes. Fighting now won't help anyone. His eyes held hers steadily. Truth will out in time. The deputies moved forward with iron shackles. Ava tried to block their path, but one roughly pushed her aside. She stumbled against the table, knocking over the bowl of dough. It hit the floor with a dull thud. Ezra submitted quietly to the restraints, though his jaw clenched when they cinched them too tight. The deputies marched him toward the door. This isn't right, Ava called after them. Sheriff, please. But Turner only touched his hat brim and followed his men out. Through the window, Ava watched them lead Ezra down the street. Townspeople gathered to stare, their faces a mix of judgment and fear. The kitchen felt suddenly vast and empty. Sarah crept back, wringing her apron. Ma'am, should I clean up the... She gestured at the spilled dough. Leave it, Ava said tonelessly. Leave everything. She drifted through the day like a ghost. The house echoed with silence. Upstairs, her husband's illness kept him oblivious to the drama unfolding below. Even the servants seemed to fade into the shadows, avoiding her gaze. As evening drew in, Ava found herself in the parlor. Outside, the town's lamplights bloomed one by one, but none of their warmth reached inside the mansion's walls. She sank to her knees beside her favorite chair, clasping her hands in her lap. Lord, she whispered, her voice breaking, I tried to do right, to bring your people together, to fix what was broken. Tears slid down her cheeks, dropping onto her folded fingers. Please, show me the way forward. Give me strength to face whatever comes. Lamplight flickered on the parlor walls, casting long shadows. The mansion creaked and settled around her, its rooms emptier than they had ever felt before. Even the harvest service's joy seemed like a distant dream now, shattered by the cold reality of power and prejudice. Ava remained on her knees, tears streaking her face as she prayed in desperate silence. The future she had glimpsed of unity, of justice, of something deeper growing between her and Ezra seemed to slip away like water through her fingers. All that remained was the hollow echo of her prayers in the darkening room. Morning mist clung to Alamosa streets as Ava hurried toward the jailhouse. Her black shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, offering little protection against the townsfolk's cold stares. She kept her eyes forward, trying to ignore the whispers that followed in her wake. Shameless woman, someone muttered. A shop door slammed shut as she passed. The jailhouse loomed ahead, its stone walls gray in the early light. Ava climbed the wooden steps, her heart pounding. Two guards blocked the entrance, their expressions hard beneath their hats. "I'm here to see Ezra McGraw," she announced, willing her voice steady. The taller guard shook his head. "No visitors." "Allowed, ma'am. Sheriff's orders." "Please," Ava pressed. "Just 5 minutes. He's been falsely accused. Best move along now." The second guard stepped forward, hand resting meaningfully on his gun belt. Wouldn't want more gossip about the governor's wife hanging around the jail. Heat rushed to Ava's cheeks. She turned away before they could see her tears, descending the steps with careful dignity. Behind her, the guards' low laughter stabbed like needles. The walk home seemed endless. Women gathered in doorways, heads bent together, falling silent as she passed. A group of children playing marbles scattered at her approach, as if she carried some terrible disease. Even the morning sun felt hostile, beating down on her unprotected head. Relief washed over her when she finally reached the mansion's gates. Inside, the familiar halls offered shelter from prying eyes, though the rooms felt emptier than ever. Sarah met her at the stairs, wringing her hands. "Ma'am, the governor's asking for you," the maid whispered. "He seems different today." Ava hurried upstairs. The sickroom air was thick with medicine smells and lingering illness. Henry lay propped against his pillows, looking frailer than ever, but his eyes held an urgent light. "Ava," he called weakly. "Come closer." She perched on the edge of his bed, taking his trembling hand. His skin felt like paper beneath her fingers. "In my desk," he wheezed. "Bottom drawer." "There's a document." She retrieved the indicated paper, bringing it back to his bedside. The governor's hand shook as he held it out to her. "My confession," he explained, each word an effort. "Written weeks ago, when I first took ill. Everything about the railroad, the bribes they paid, why I signed that cursed treaty." He broke into a fit of coughing. Ava scanned the pages, her eyes widening. Names, dates, amounts all carefully recorded in a lawyer's precise hand. At the bottom, Henry's signature sprawled shakily but clear. "Use it," he whispered, "when the moment's right. Set things straight." His grip on her hand tightened. "I'm sorry, Ava. Should have been. Stronger. Rest now," she soothed, but his eyes were already closing. Within minutes, his breathing settled into the heavy rhythm of unconsciousness. The doctor, summoned hastily, confirmed he had slipped into a deep decline. Hours crept by. Ava moved through the house like a ghost, the confession burning in her pocket. As darkness fell, she settled into her sewing chair beside the parlor window. The document lay in her lap, its pages stark white in the lamplight. Outside, coyotes began their nightly chorus, their wild voices echoing off the hills. The sound made her shiver, reminding her how alone she was. The railroad men were circling, like wolves, using lies and false charges to destroy everything she and Ezra had built. Yet even as fear clutched at her heart, other memories surfaced. Margaret O'Leary's fierce defense of her at town meetings. Elder Nanton's grave nod of respect when she admitted her husband's wrongs. The way widows and children had sung together at the harvest service, hope bright in their faces. She smoothed the confessions pages, feeling the weight of truth in her hands. Here was proof of the railroad's corruption, a weapon that could shatter their schemes. Henry had given her the key to justice, if she found the courage to use it. Steel settled in her spine as she stared into the gathering dark. She was not truly alone. Somewhere in the jail, Ezra waited, believing in her strength. In scattered cabins and camps, others still trusted in her promise of fairness. The railroad men had miscalculated if they thought to break her with mere rumors and lies. The coyotes called again, wild and free. Ava straightened in her chair, tucking the precious documents safely away. Tomorrow would bring new battles, but tonight she had found her resolve. Truth would indeed stand taller than lies. No matter the cost. Dawn painted the eastern sky in hushed pinks and golds as Ava guided her horse along the rutted trail. The confession document lay secure in her saddlebag, its weight both burden and promise. Her shoulders ached from a sleepless night, but determination drove her forward. Widow O'Leary's cabin appeared first, smoke curling from its chimney into the crisp morning air. The older woman stood in her doorway, arms crossed, watching Ava. "Approach. Land's sake, child," Margaret called out. "You look like you ain't slept a wink." Ava dismounted stiffly. "I need your help, Margaret. All of you." She pulled the confession from her bag, hands trembling. The governor wrote this before he fell ill. Proof of the railroad's bribes. Margaret's weathered hands steadied the pages as she read, her eyes widening. "Lord above," she whispered. "This changes everything. Will you gather the other widows?" Ava asked. "I'm riding to the Apache camps next. Tonight we march together." Margaret's jaw set firmly. "You just watch me. I'll have every woman from here to Carter's Creek ready by sunset." Ava rode on, the morning sun climbing higher. At the edge of town, where scattered teepees stood among scrub oak, Elder Nanton met her with grave courtesy. She dismounted and approached on foot, showing proper respect. "My husband's words," she explained, offering the confession. "The truth about broken promises." The elder studied the document carefully, then met her eyes. "You bring this alone? At risk to yourself?" "I trust in justice," Ava replied. "Will you stand with us tonight?" Nanton nodded slowly. "We will come. Our children will sing your hymns." Through the long afternoon, word spread like wind through prairie grass. Women gathered in doorways, sharing whispered plans. Children practiced hymns in hushed voices. As twilight approached, figures moved through deepening shadows toward the edge of town. Ava waited at the agreed meeting place, her heart thundering. First came the widows, led by Margaret, carrying lanterns that gleamed against the darkening sky. Then native families appeared, moving quietly, their own lamps adding to the growing light. Children clustered together, white and brown faces alike lifted in hope. "Ready?" Margaret asked softly, pressing a lantern into Ava's hands. Ava raised the confession high, its pages catching lantern light. "For justice," she answered. The procession began. Dozens of lanterns bobbed like earthbound stars as they moved through town streets. Hymn voices rose, sweet and clear in the evening air. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound. Townsfolk emerged from shops and homes, drawn by the music. Some turned away, but others joined, swelling their numbers. The confession held steady in Ava's upraised hand as she led them toward the jailhouse. Sheriff Turner stood on the jailhouse steps, hand nervous on his gun belt. His deputies shifted uneasily as the crowd of women and children surrounded the building, their lanterns casting dancing shadows on brick walls. "Mrs. Winslow," Turner called out, "what's the meaning of this?" Ava stepped forward, her voice shaking, but clear. "I have proof of the railroad's corruption, Sheriff. My husband signed confession of their bribes." She held the document higher. "Ezra McGraw is innocent. You must release him." The hymns continued, wrapping around her words. "Was blind, but now I see." Through the jailhouse window, Ezra pressed against the bars, his face lit by lantern glow. Hope kindled in his eyes as he watched Ava stand firm before the sheriff. Turner's gaze moved from the confession to the crowd of witnesses. Widows stared back steadily. Native mothers held their children close, the moral weight of their united presence pressed against his hesitation. "Please," Ava said softly, "read the confession. Do what's right." The hymns swelled stronger, echoing off brick walls. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, children's voices lifted clear and pure into the night air. Lantern light flickered across faces filled with hope and determination. The sheriff looked from Ava to the crowd and back again, seeing truth written in their unwavering stance. Behind his jail cell bars, Ezra listened to the hymns rising outside. His hand gripped the iron rails as he watched Ava through the window, her figure straight and proud in the lantern light. For the first time since his arrest, real hope stirred in his chest. He wasn't alone anymore. None of them were. The voices of women and children continued to fill the night, their song carrying a power greater than any weapon. "'Tis grace that brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home." Sheriff Turner's hands trembled slightly as he worked the iron key into the cell lock. The hymns still echoed outside, carried on the evening air. With a heavy clank, the door swung open. Ezra stepped out slowly, his boots scuffing against the wooden floor. 3 days of imprisonment had left his clothes dirty and his beard unkempt, but his eyes burned bright with unbroken spirit. He moved toward the jailhouse entrance, squinting as lamplight spilled through the doorway. Outside, the gathered crowd parted to make way. Ava stood at the bottom of the wooden steps, the confession papers clutched tight in one hand. Without hesitation, she reached out and clasped Ezra's calloused hand in hers. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Several townsfolk turned away, muttering about impropriety, but others stood straighter, inspired by her boldness. "To the town hall," Ava called out, her voice carrying clear across the crowd. "Everyone must hear the truth tonight." The procession moved through darkened streets, lanterns bobbing like fireflies. Word spread quickly. Lights appeared in windows, doors opened, and more townspeople joined their march. By the time they reached the town hall, its wooden steps were crowded with curious onlookers dot inside. Oil lamps cast flickering shadows across rough-hewn walls. Railroad men lounged near the front, including Baron Pritchard himself, their fine, suits standing out among the townspeople's worn clothing. Pritchard's face twisted into a sneer as Ava and Ezra entered. "Well, if it ain't the governor's wayward wife," he drawled. "Come to entertain us with more fairy tales." Ava ignored him, moving to the front of the hall. Her hand shook slightly as she unfolded the confession, but her voice rang strong and clear. "These are my husband's own words, written as he lay dying, his conscience heavy with truth he could no longer bear." The room fell silent as she began to read. "I, Henry Winslow, governor of this territory, do hereby confess to accepting bribes from the Western Railroad Company. The sum of $5,000 was paid to secure my signature on treaties stealing land from both settlers and native peoples. My shame knows no bounds." Gasps filled the room. Pritchard's face darkened as Ava continued reading, detailing specific dates, amounts, and the names of railroad agents involved in the scheme. When she finished, the silence hung thick as morning fog. Ezra stepped forward then, his deep voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "I've walked these mountains 30 years, he said. "Last month, I found railroad survey stakes driven through Apache burial grounds. Stakes marked with dates before the treaty was even signed." He paused, letting that sink in. They knew they'd buy this corruption. They planned it all along. Angry mutters rippled through the crowd. Several ranchers who'd been standing near. Pritchard moved away, leaving him increasingly isolated. The railroad men shifted uneasily, hands straying toward hidden weapons. "Lies!" Pritchard shouted, but his voice cracked. "You can't prove any of this." "The governor's own hand says different." Sheriff Turner spoke up from near the door, his badge catching lamplight. "That there's a legal confession, signed and witnessed proper." More townspeople were backing away from the railroad men now. "Widow." O'Leary pointed a gnarled finger at Pritchard. "You tried to drive us from our homes. Used false papers to shame good people." The mood in the room turned dangerous. Pritchard's eyes darted toward the door, but angry faces blocked his path. His men bunched closer together, outnumbered and uncertain. Ava swayed slightly, the emotional toll of the evening catching up to her. Ezra's arm came around her shoulders, strong and steady. She leaned into his support, no longer caring who saw or what they might whisper. They had fought for truth together and won. The governor's confession will go to the territorial judge, Sheriff Turner announced, moving to take the document from Ava's trembling hands. Meanwhile, I reckon these railroad fellows might want to catch the next train east. His hand rested meaningfully on his gun belt. Pritchard's face was thunderous, but he had no choice. The crowd parted silently, creating a path to the door. One by one, the railroad men filed out into the night, their footsteps fading toward the station. Ava's legs finally gave way. She sank onto a wooden bench, Ezra settling beside her. The townspeople gathered close, widows, ranchers, native families, their faces warm with gratitude and respect. The lantern light caught the tears on Ava's cheeks as she smiled up at them, spent but victorious. Margaret O'Leary stepped forward, patting Ava's hand. "You done right by us all, child," she said softly. "Both of you did?" The crowd murmured agreement. Outside, the autumn wind whispered through yellow cottonwood leaves, carrying away the last echoes of hymns and the heavy burden of long-held secrets. Justice had finally found its voice in the flickering lantern light of a Colorado town hall. Dawn painted the Colorado sky in gentle strokes of pink and gold. The morning air carried a crisp bite, autumn leaves dancing on the breeze. Alamosa stirred to life slowly, its streets oddly quiet without the usual bustle of railroad men in their fine suits. Word spread quickly through town. Baron Pritchard and his cohorts had slipped away on the pre-dawn train, their elaborate scheme of lies unraveled by a simple confession. Sheriff Turner posted notices on the telegraph office door, announcing that formal indictments would follow from the territorial court dock by mid-morning. Townspeople began gathering at the reopened church. They came in twos and threes, shopkeepers closing their stores early, ranchers leaving their cattle to hired hands, widows walking arm in arm. Apache families arrived on horseback, their children's eyes bright with curiosity. The church bells rang out clear and sweet, calling the community together. Sunlight streamed through newly washed windows, catching dust motes in golden beams. The wooden pews filled quickly, while latecomers stood along the walls. Ava Winslow stood near the altar, her face showing the strain of recent days yet glowing with quiet joy. Her black dress was simple but elegant, her spine straight despite her weariness. Near the doorway, Ezra McGraw leaned against the wall, his powerful frame somehow uncertain in this space of hymns and prayers. His eyes never left Ava, though. He made no move to join her. "I want to thank you all," Ava began, her voice carrying to every corner. "When I first came to this town, I was a stranger, but you opened your hearts to truth." She smiled at Widow O'Leary, who dabbed at her eyes. "With a handkerchief? You stood together, ranchers and merchants, widows and elders, and proved that justice can overcome greed." Elder Nanton nodded solemnly from his place among the Apache families. His weathered face held new respect as he watched the governor's wife address her people. "The railroad men thought they could divide us," Ava continued. "They tried to turn neighbor against neighbor, white against native, rich against poor. But they failed because you chose to see with your hearts instead of your fears." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the congregation. Several people turned to smile at those seated nearby, smiles that bridged old divisions of culture and class. The celebration continued through the afternoon. Women brought pies and bread to share. Children played in the churchyard while their parents talked in low voices about the future. Hope hung in the air like the sweet scent of baking apples. As evening approached, a servant boy arrived from the mansion, his face grave. He whispered urgently to Ava, who paled and hurried away. Ezra watched her go, concern etching deep lines around his eyes. In the governor's bedchamber, shadows lengthened across fine carpets. Henry Winslow lay still against his pillows, breath coming in shallow gasps. Ava took his hand gently, feeling its papery softness. "My dear," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You were braver than I." His fingers tightened weakly around hers. "Braver by far. Rest easy," Ava soothed, though tears slid down her cheeks. "The truth is known now. Justice will be done." The governor's eyes closed. His breath slowed, then stilled. Ava bent to kiss his forehead, her tears falling onto his peaceful face. The bells began to toll across town, their deep voices carrying news of the governor's passing. Ava remained at his bedside until the doctor came, then walked numbly down the mansion's grand staircase and out into the cool night air. Ezra waited in the garden, a solid shadow among the rustling trees. He said nothing, but his presence offered quiet strength. Ava moved closer, drawn to his warmth in the autumn chill. The bells continued their slow song of mourning, counting out the governor's years. "I'm tired of pretending," she whispered, her voice rough with tears. She took Ezra's arm, feeling the muscle tense beneath her fingers. "Stay with me. Not for show, not for protection, but because we both know what's real between us." Ezra's eyes softened as he looked down at her. The wariness that had haunted him since his wife's death seemed to fade. He covered her hand with his own work-roughened fingers, gentle against her skin. Above them, stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky. The bells tolled on, but their sound was changing. No longer a dirge, but a song of endings and beginnings, of truth revealed, and love finally spoken plain. Morning sunlight spilled across Alamosa's dusty streets like honey, warming the crisp autumn air. Church bells pealed across town, their clear voices calling people to gather, not for a funeral dirge, but for something brighter, a marking of passage, of endings wrapped in new beginnings. Townsfolk streamed toward the white-painted church, their boots and shoes clicking against wooden sidewalks. Apache families rode in from the outskirts, their children's dark eyes bright with wonder. Widow O'Leary herded a group of youngsters ahead of her, their Sunday clothes already showing signs of play at the mansion gates. Ava Winslow paused, drawing a deep breath. Her black dress was simple but elegant, trimmed with modest lace at throat and wrists. Beside her stood Ezra McGraw, his usually stern face softened by something new, belonging. "Shall we?" Ava asked quietly, her smile genuine and unguarded. Ezra offered his arm without hesitation. "Reckon it's time we walked this path proper." They moved down Main Street together, no longer hiding behind pretense or protection. Shop owners nodded respectfully from their doorways. Miners touched their caps in greeting. Even those who had whispered scandal weeks before found themselves smiling at the sight of them. Children darted past, laughing as they chased each other through morning shadows. Their joy seemed to lift the solemn weight of the governor's passing, replacing it with hope. From the church steps came the sound of women's voices raised in song, familiar hymns floating on the breeze. Elder Nanton stood near the church doors, his weathered face dignified as he watched them approach. He raised one hand in greeting, approval, clear in his dark eyes. "The path of truth," he said simply, "leads to healing." Ava felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of gratitude. Her faith, once formal and dutiful, now burned brighter than ever. She had seen God's hand at work in the midst of struggle, in widows' kindness, in children's laughter, in love that grew from desperate pretense to lasting truth. Beside her, Ezra walked tall and steady. The scars he carried, both visible and hidden, no longer marked him as an outsider. Here, among these people who had chosen justice over greed, mercy over revenge, he had found his place again. More than that, he had found family. They climbed the church steps together, passing through doors thrown wide to welcome all. Inside, lanterns glowed warm against polished wood, their light catching the edges of copper and tin cups set ready for communion. The space filled quickly, ranchers beside merchants, widows next to elders, white and native children sharing hymn books with curious fingers. Ava and Ezra moved down the center aisle, their hands clasped without shame or secret. Above them, morning sun streamed through stained glass windows, painting them in colors of amber, rose, and deep blue. They took their place in the front pew as the last bell rang out clear and sweet, a song of resurrection, of community reborn, of love finally spoken plain and true. Thanks for spending a moment here with me. If this story touched you, let's keep this connection going. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.